Hello, you are watching Dr. Muhammad Yousaf YouTube channel, and the topic of today's talk is variables and their types in research. So let's start today's talk. A variable. A variable is any kind of attribute or characteristics that we are trying to measure or manipulate or control in statistics or research. A variable value or a variable's value uh, can change between groups or over time. So it means that the value of variables keeps on changing, and that's why we call it a variable. I mean, the opposite of variable is constant. The value for a constant is always the same. So that's why we call it a variable, because its value keep on changing. In communication research, particularly if we talk, variables are critical in analyzing how messages are created, transmitted, and received, as well as the effects of communication on individuals and societies. So, this talk focuses on the key types of variable commonly used in communication research or social research. So, briefly putting the things in, today's talk will focus on variables, their examples, and their various kinds which we used in research. So let's start from the first one, independent variable. In experimental research, the variable that is manipulated or changed to observe its effect on another variable is called independent variable. So independent variable actually is the variable which we manipulate or which we change so that we can observe its effect on another variable. In communication research, this often refers to the aspects of the message, the medium, or the context. In experimental research, independent variable may be called antecedent variables, experimental variables, treatment variables, or even causal variables. Keto 2015. So, in when we talk about the experimental research, different names are used to label independent variable. So they could be, they could be these names: antecedent variables, experimental variable, treatment variable, or even causal variables or experimental variable. In non-experimental research, what we call observational research, independent variable is called predictor variable or criterion variable. So that is the main difference between experimental research and observational research. In experimental research, the independent variable is called the experimental variable or independent variable, while in non-experimental research or observational research, the variable which is called independent in experimental, we called it predictor variable or criterion variable in observational research. So that is the main difference. Let me give you an example to further illustrate it. If a study examines how different forms of media, like television, radio, or social media, affect people's political knowledge, the type of media exposure would be an independent variable. Like media, forms of media, it has three levels right now: TV, radio, or social media. So this variable, what we call media, and it has the three levels, this is called an independent variable. So maybe television would have the different effects, radio may have even different effects than compared to the TV, and even social media. So media in this example is an independent variable. And of course, the political knowledge or people's political knowledge is a dependent variable. Then dependent variable, DV. In experimental research, the variable that is measured to assess the effect of the independent variable, we call it dependent variable, or sometimes we use DV for it. So the most important thing is that dependent variable is the variable which we actually measure in our research. And how we measure it? Because we measure the effect of independent variable or criterion variable on this variable. I mean the kind of changes which take place or which are created in independent variable, we measure their effect on dependent variable. So it is the outcome or the result variable. Sometimes it's also called the outcome variable or result variable in research as well. In non-experimental research or observational research, it is called outcome variable. So when we talk about the experimental research, then this is called a dependent variable. When we talk about the observational research or non-experimental research, then dependent variable is labeled as outcome variable. So let's consider an example to further explain it. In the study of a media exposure on political knowledge would be the dependent variable. So media exposure is a independent variable, because if we change the exposure, like exposure to television, exposure to social media, exposure to print media and so on, so then it will affect the political knowledge. So political knowledge actually, which we will measure in this example, is a dependent variable, as it is the outcome variable being measured based on the type of exposure to the different forms of media. So this is a very important example to understand the difference between dependent variable and independent variable. And if we talk about the experimental research and observational research, then we use different labels or different names for independent variable and dependent variable. I mean, this should be clear from my talk until now. And then we move to the control variables. I mean, variables that are kept constant or controlled to prevent them from affecting the relationship between independent and dependent variables. We label them as control variables. Let's take an example. In a study on the effects of persuasive advertisements on consumer behavior, factors like age, income level, or prior brand familiarity could be treated as control variables. So if we control them, then we can look at the effect of persuasive advertising on the consumer behavior. But if we don't control, like the age or income level or prior brand, I mean knowledge, then these variables can affect the relationship between persuasive advertisements and consumer behavior. So if we control age, income level, and prior brand knowledge or familiarity, then we could purely look at the effect of independent variable on dependent variable. So that's why we label these variables as control variables. I mean, ensuring that the differences in these factors do not influence the results. In other words, the differences or the changing of these variables does not affect the impact of independent variable on dependent variable or outcome variable. So then comes the extraneous variables, variables that are not intentionally studied but may still influence the dependent variable. We label them as extraneous variables. In communication research, this can include unexpected factors like mood or the background noise, which are actually not the focus of the study, but they may affect the results of the study. So let's take an example to explain this. In a study of how tone of the voice affects customer satisfaction during a phone call, an extraneous variable could be customer's mood prior to the call. I mean, we want to look at that how the tone of the voice affects customer satisfaction about a brand or during a phone call. But if the one who is going to make a call, his mood is different. I mean, he's in a good mood or he's in a bad mood, then this mood may also affect the tone of the person who is going to have a call, and then this can affect customers satisfaction during a call as well. So this variable, what we call the mood, is an extraneous variable. Actually, in the beginning, it was not the focus of the research, but this may affect the results of the research. That's why we label it as an extraneous variable. And then is the confounding variables. a type of extraneous variable that correlates with both the independent and dependent variables, potentially distorting the observed relationship, or what we call affecting the observed relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. We call them a confounding variable. For example, in a study on the impact of social media usage on self-esteem, in this example, social media usage is an independent variable and self-esteem is a dependent variable. But if we include time spent on social media, then the time spent on a social media is a confounding variable that may affect a relationship between, or the impact of social media usage on the self-esteem of any individual. So in this case, time spent on social media might be confounded by how much social comparison individual engage in online, because those who spend more time on social media, they have more exposure with different things on the social media. So maybe they would have more comparison regarding their self-esteem and the self-esteem the other people. So maybe in this case, the time spent is affecting the self-esteem, not the social media actual usage. So in this example, the time spent on the social media may act as a confounding variable that can affect the impact of social media usage on the self-esteem. So when we are conducting a research, we need to be very careful and we need to control these confounding variables or extraneous variables or the control variables if we want to purely separate the effect of independent variable or the predictor on the independent variable or the criterion variable. Then are the intervening variables, and this example will explain in detail that how the variables can affect the pure relationship between independent and dependent variables. So the variables that come between independent and dependent variables and may influence the relationship but are not directly observed because we don't measure them, but they may then even affect the relationship between, or the impact of independent variables on dependent variables. We label them or we call them as intervening variables. So this is an example, a very interesting example, which explains how variables take place in chain, because the variables does not come in isolation. They take place in chain and they affect the relationship between, or the impact of independent variable on dependent variables. So let's take a very simple example. In a study investigating the effect of social media on interpersonal relationships, online interaction quality may be an intervening variable that influence how social media usage impacts relationship satisfaction. So that's very, very important. So social media effect on interpersonal relationship, social media impact or social media effect or social media usage is an independent variable, or effect on interpersonal relationship is a dependent variable. But online interaction quality may be an intervening variable which can affect the result between, the relationship or the impact or the result of social media on personal interpersonal relationships. So in this case, online interaction could act as an intervening variable. So let's take another example. Marital status causes the degree of social integration. So in this example, a very simple one, so a marital status, married or not married, is or divorced, whatever the marital status is, that is an independent variable, and that causes the degree of social integration. That's a very important preposition. That is an independent. That is a dependent variable. So marital status is IV, independent variable, and degree of association or integration is dv, is a dependent variable in this case. But if I add another variable which affects suicide, then marital status becomes an independent variable, suicide becomes dependent variable, and degree of social integration becomes intervening variable. So in this case, actually the marital status affects suicide. This is a very classic example which was used by Emile Durkheim in his book Suicide, which was published in 1922. to explain how a marital status affects suicide. But this marital status apparently looking doesn't affect suicide directly. Rather, it affects suicide through the chain of variables which we will talk now, and one of them is degree of social integration. So let me give you the example how this affects takes place in a chain. For that, we take a very simple example. Family disruption causes lower self-esteem among children, which causes poor grades in school, which causes a reduced prospects for job, which causes an lower adult income. So let's look at this example to explain this example in detail. Family disruption causes lower self-esteem among children. So if we consider these two variables, then family disruption is an independent variable, and lower self-esteem among children is a dependent variable. For example, those kids who come from the broken families, usually they have lower self-esteem. This is a very common phenomenon which we can observe in our daily lives. So let's add another variable to explain the mechanism of intervening variables. So we add which causes poor grades in school. So family disruption causes lower self esteem among children, which causes lower grades in schools. So if we treat family disruption as an independent variable and poor grades in school as a dependent variable, then low self-esteem becomes an intervening variable, because family disruption causes lower self-esteem. Lower self-esteem causes lower grades in school, which causes a reduced prospects in job. So let's include another variable, reduced prospects for the job. So if family disruption is a dependent variable, and a reduced opportunities or reduced chances for the job is a dependent variable, then this chain will walk like family disruption causes low self-esteem. Lower self-esteem causes poor grades in the school, and poor grades, I mean, those who get poor grades, of course, they would have the less chances of getting a good job. Let's include another variable in this equation which causes a lower adult income. So if we take family disruption as an independent variable and lower adult income as a dependent variable, so let's now consider how this chain works. Family disruption causes lower self-esteem among kids, which causes poor grades in the school, which causes reduced prospects in job, and which, of course, if a person doesn't get a good job, I mean, get a very common job, then that person would have a very low adult income. So let's now consider how family disruption affects low, I mean, self-esteem of the individuals, and how that self-esteem affects the grades in the school, and how the grades affects the opportunities or the chances of a job, and how jobs affects the lower adult income, and how the lower adult income affects social status. If a person gets or earns low income in a month or monthly lower income, then his social status will be affected. So this chain of relationship tells us that the variables walk in a chain, and one variable affects another variable, another variable affects another variable. Then if a family disruption and low self-esteem are treated, then this is IV, this is DV. If we add another variable, then this become IV, this become DV, this becomes an intervening variable. And if I take initial variable as IV and this lower adult income as DV, then I have three variables which are intervening variable. Lower self-esteem is a intervening variable, poor grades in school is an intervening variable, reduced prospects is an intervening variable, and they actually in interaction they affect the income of an adult. So now let's come back to this example. Marital status causes suicide through the degree of social integration, because those who are married are more integrated. They have someone, I mean, they can talk, they can share their joys, they can share their sorrows, they can share their problems, they can share their achievements, and this actually develops social integration, and the higher the social integration, the lesser the chances of suicide. So marital status apparently doesn't affect suicide, but in an indirect way, marital status actually through degree of social integration affects suicide rates among the individual. So marital status is IV, suicide tendency is a DV, and degree of association is an intervening variable. So this is how the variables work in a chain. So let's move to another variable, moderator variables. So intervening variables, we can divide them into two types. Moderator variables or mediator variables. So let's first talk about the moderator variables. Variables that affect the strength or the direction of relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. We label them as moderator variables. They show under what conditions or for whom the relationship might change. But this is very important that when we are measuring the moderation, or when we are looking at the moderation of a variable, actually we are looking how, under what conditions and for whom the relationship might change. And let's take an interesting example to further explain the phenomena of moderation in a research. In a study examining the effects of media violence on aggression, gender might be a moderator. So, effect of media violence is an independent. Media violence is an independent variable. Aggression is a dependent variable. But if we consider gender, so the gender could act as a moderator, because the impact of violent content on aggression could be stronger in males than females. So maybe media violence can affect males and females in terms of aggression in a different way, so indicating that the relationship depends on gender. So apparently speaking, we know that media violence affects aggression among individuals, but actually this media violence acts on aggression among individuals through gender. It could be age as well, it could be the income as well, it could be the background as well. So the variables, under what conditions, so under males or females, under what conditions, rural or the urban, under what conditions for the older people or for the younger people. So these variables act as moderators between the independent variable and the dependent variable, and they affect the strength of the relationship between independent variable and the dependent variable, or they can change the direction of relationship between independent variable and the dependent variable. And then the last one is a mediator variable. So this is also a class of intervening variables. So variables that explain the mechanism through which the independent variable influences the dependent variable. This is an effect, very important proposition, that mediator is the variable through which independent variable affects dependent variable. So this is a kind of path analysis, a path through which the independent variable can affect the dependent variable. So they help clarify how and why a relationship occurs. So this is very important. Actually, the mediation tells us that how and why a relationship occurs, while moderation tells us that under what conditions and when the variable affects, independent variable affects dependent variable. So let's take this example in a study about how exposure to persuasive advertisement, which is an IV independent variable, leads to brand loyalty, which is a DV variable. So persuasive advertisements affects anyone's brand loyalty. The more the persuasive advertisement is, the higher the brand loyalty is among the public. This is the line of action, or this is the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable. But if we change attitude, change could be a mediator, explaining that ads first change people's attitude, which in turn affects their loyalty. So if positive attitude change takes place as a result of persuasive advertisements, then of course there will be more brand loyalty among the customers or among the publics. But if there is a negative attitude change as a result of persuasive advertisements, then of course there will be less or reduced or decreased brand loyalty among the customers or among the publics. So this is how independent variable affects dependent variable through a different path or indirect way, which we call mediation, or this variable is called a mediator variable. And the last one, the latent variables, very important class of variables, the variables that are not directly observed but are inferred from measurable indicator. This is a very important thing. I mean, these kind of variables are not directly measurable. Actually, we infer them. We try to conclude, we try to infer that actually what these variables mean or how these variables function from measurable indicators, often used in a survey or psychological research in communication studies, like competence, communication competence, like cognitive dissonance, communication resistance, like self-esteem. All these variables which I now discussed with you, these are actually the latent variables because they are not directly observed, like a religiosity of a person. I mean, how much a person is religious or non-religious, we cannot directly observe it. Actually, we can infer how many times a person says a prayer. We can infer that many times a person observe fast, how many times a person gives zakat, and how many times a person goes to offer hajj. So these are the indicators which we can infer. And similarly, I mean, if we talk about the feminism, I mean, how much one is feminist, so we cannot measure it. We can only infer from the indicators, like how much one believes in the educational independence or equality for men and women, how much one believes in the equality of politics. I mean, taking part in politics for men and women. The higher the tendency of a person, the higher the feminist attitude of a person. So actually, in this case, we are inferring the variables. Actually, we are not actually measuring them. For example, so let's consider this example: communication competence. How effectively someone communicates is a latent variable that may be inferred from observable behavior, like clear articulation, that how clearly one speaks, non-verbal clues, that how clearly or how effectively one uses gestures to communicate one messages, and message coherence, that how coherent is the message which one intends to communicate. So these elements or these indicators or these dimensions help us to infer that how much communication competence one person has compared to another person. So communication competence is a latent variable because it is not directly observable. So this is a very important class of variable in social research and communication research and even psychological research, because the variable like self-esteem, like communication competence, like cognitive dissonance, all these variables are feminism, like religiosity of a person. All these variables are labeled under the class of latent variables. So interaction variables, when we talk about moderation, there is another a variable which we sometimes use, we call them interaction variables, though it comes under the class of moderator variables, but I'm going to treat them separate here so that it's more clear. In communication research, interaction variables reflect the combined effect of two or more variables on independent variables. So this is an important example. Then when we want to look at the combined effect of more than one independent variables on one dependent variable, we call that effect on an interaction effect. So that effect is labeled as an interaction effect. If we look at the a single effect of a single variable on a single dependent variable, then we call that a unique effect of an independent variable. But when we look at the combined effect of more than two independent variables on a dependent variable, we call that an interaction effect. They explore how the relationship between one independent variable and the dependent variable changes depending on the level of another independent variable. So when we combine two independent variables, then of course their effect on the dependent variable changes. So let's take an example. In a study on the media influence, The interaction between political orientation and media exposure may predict voting behavior. So, if there are two independent variables, one is political orientation and another is a media exposure. So, IV1 and IV2. So, if we separately look at their effect on the dependent variable, which is a voting behavior, we call this unique contribution of each independent variable. The relationship between media exposure and voting might differ for liberal versus the conservatives. So, if the other variables, I mean, which is broken, which is dichotomous and is broken into the liberals and conservatives, so maybe the media exposure can affect on the voting behavior different for the liberals as compared to the conservatives. And these type of variables are usually used in factorial research design, where we combine the independent variables and we look at their combined effect on the dependent variable. So these are the references which I have used to prepare this lecture. Freiboten and Krebs. This is a very classic book on investigating communication and introduction to research method. This is a good book for those who are majoring in communication, because all the examples included in this book are from communication major. Ketone, communication research, asking question, finding answer. Again, very good book for those who are from communication major or media or mass communication. New and social research method, qualitative and quantitative approaches. Very good book for those who come from sociology, from political science, from psychology, and even from any discipline of social research, because this is a very good book and I mean, very comprehensive book. And then also Sarantako's Social Research fourth edition is also very good book, because these two books are on social research. So they are very useful for any student who is majoring in social research, any subject like economics, like business, like commerce, like I mean political science, like sociology, like social work, or like international relation, like communication, any of them. So I think this is all from this lecture. So hope you find it very useful, very productive, and you have a clarity about variables and the different classes of variables which we used in research. And after watching this lecture, you have more clarity. And if there is any still query, still question about variables and their different classes, you can write your comments in the comment box. I would love to answer all your queries and comments.